Hello, my name is Laura Siemens. Thank you for having me back. I spoke here last year when I talked about the pro-life argument against abortion, and today I want to share with you the pro-life argument against euthanasia. So for those of you who don't know me, a little bit about who I am. I'm a wife and a mother of 4 adult young ladies. I love my country, I love my family, but I do worry sometimes about the country we're leaving to the next generation. In 2016, I was driving in my car to go and pick up my 11-year-old daughter from a birthday party. And as I was driving, I was listening to the radio, and I heard the news that Canada had officially legalized euthanasia, and I was horrified. When I arrived at the birthday party to pick up my daughter, all the parents are, standing outside, catching up and chatting. Most of our kids all went to the same private Christian school. And when I told them what I had just heard, the reaction was, wow, that's too bad. Our world, right? Going right downhill. And then the topic was immediately changed. And to be honest, it didn't really seem like anyone cared. Murder had just become legal in our country. But that's not really a polite conversation, especially not here in Canada. Over the last 9 years, I've watched as the church has remained silent. And even worse, when I mention to people that I speak against euthanasia, I am met, even in Christian circles, with people who are pro-euthanasia. So my goal today is to first personalize this issue with you, explain why this topic is something you should care about, and then show you how to talk to those people around you who maybe don't understand what exactly is happening here in Canada. When I first heard about the legalization of euthanasia, I was horrified at the very idea of it, but it wasn't really personalized. Then just a few years later, I attended a funeral, and only after the funeral did I learn that this person had been euthanized and his own children had given him the drug. This is a person I'd known my whole life. He'd served in churches, he sent his children to private Christian schools, he was a conservative Christian, and he was killed by his sons. 2 years ago, my mother died of cancer, and when she was told she had cancer and that it was too aggressive to treat, she was offered MAiD, which is euthanization. The same day she's given the diagnosis. She was very clear about not wanting that. And my father was told that they could give her MAiD if she ever changed her mind, and my father would not even be notified. We took my mom home. I was terrified to leave her in the hospital. And just a week before she died, she asked us to pray that God would take her home soon. Had she asked us that in the hospital within earshot of a doctor, that would have been extremely dangerous. Today, I have someone I love very much who's been diagnosed with a disease that doesn't have a cure. The biggest fear for me is that a doctor or nurse is going to convince this person to end their life. It's a huge problem when we can't trust our healthcare professionals not to kill our loved ones. And if you think this won't touch you, the truth is it may already have. You may already know people who are considering this option or who have already died from this path. In 2016, Canada became one of the 7 countries to legalize euthanasia. With the introduction of Bill C-7, the law was expanded to include non-terminal conditions. Canada now has the world's fastest growing medical assistance in dying program, known as MAiD. Euthanasia is currently legal in several countries: Australia, Belgium, Canada, Colombia, Ecuador, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, and New Zealand, Portugal, and Spain. However, Canada stands out because we have the fastest growing euthanasia program. Canada and California both introduced MAiD in 2016. Now, for reference, Canada and California have roughly the same population. Since 2016, 893 people have been given MAiD in California. However, in Canada, during that same time period, almost 50,000 people have been euthanized in Canada. Why is Canada's program expanding so rapidly? Let's take a closer look at what makes Canada's approach different from other countries. First, there's no case reviews. Euthanasia cases are not subject to independent review. This makes oversight minimal. Nurse practitioners can perform euthanasia. Unlike the other countries where only doctors can perform euthanasia, Canada allows nurse practitioners to administer this life-ending procedure. There's no requirement to try medical treatments first. Patients who are seeking euthanasia in Canada are not required to demonstrate that they have attempted available medical treatments first to alleviate their condition. Euthanasia can be offered, not just requested. Patients don't need to initiate the conversation. Nurses and doctors will suggest euthanasia and present it as a treatment option. And in fact, nurses and doctors are often forced to present this as a treatment option, even if it goes against their own personal convictions. And the impact on this? MAiD is now the 5th leading cause of death in Canada. It's surpassed only by cancer, heart disease, COVID-19, and accidents. Here are a few important things to know. Only 3.5% of requests in Canada are denied. Requests and the death can happen on the same day. And Ontario and Quebec MAiD numbers are not counted in Canada's stats because Ontario and Quebec don't always put MAiD down for the cause of death, even if it is the cause of death. So when we look at our numbers, we have to remember those numbers, which is, remember I said almost 50,000, do not include Ontario or Quebec. With more than 10,000 Canadians dying from medical assistant deaths annually, a recent report from the Netherlands showed that Canada is the global leader in harvesting organs from patients who undergo doctor-assisted suicide. This study was published by the Dutch researchers in the American Journal of Transplantation. They reviewed the growing practice, which is known as organ donation after euthanasia, or ODE. Out of 268 documented cases of ODE worldwide, nearly half, which is 136 of those cases, occurred in Canada. That means out of all of the cases worldwide, Canada had more than all the rest of the countries combined. Now remember, you can't donate an organ if you are dead. Now I know this is another sensitive topic, but just a quick breakdown. You can only donate an organ if you are still technically alive, and the term they use is brain dead. You can donate an organ if you're brain dead, but you can't be dead. Let me explain what I mean. If you're in a car accident and you're decapitated, as in your head is outside the car and your body is inside the car, you are dead, and you can't donate your organs. We should probably discuss the ethics of creating a new category of dead called brain dead, but that's for another topic. But know this, you can't be dead and donate an organ. Also, all potential donors are assessed for medical suitability, which includes a review of their health history and a blood test that looks for antibodies in the blood. So, for example, you can't have cancer and donate your organs. So knowing all of this, it's extremely concerning, and there's a lot of questions that we need to ask when we know that Canada has been harvesting organs from patients who have undergone euthanasia, and they've harvested more of these organs than the rest of the world combined. Now, we're going to talk about this sensitive topic, but there's a lot of sensitive topics that I like to talk about and that I want to encourage other people to talk about. One of the things people are concerned about is, what if I have this conversation with a coworker or a family member and then it hurts our relationship? There's a pattern that I use when I talk about these sensitive topics. It's the same pattern I use when I talk about abortion, and it helps to be able to have these conversations, open up a place to be able to talk and to think without ruining a relationship. First thing you do is you find a place where you can agree. Then you tell a story. Then you ask a question, and you give them time to think. You don't have to solve the entire conversation each time. Remember, you're not talking to an evil person. You're talking to a person that you love, who has been brainwashed or who simply hasn't had the full conversation before. So what is the pro-life stance on euthanasia? When I speak about pro-life issues, one of the first questions I get is, what is your stance on euthanasia? And I'm often surprised by how many people are either unsure about their stance or they openly support euthanasia, even though they consider themselves to be pro-life. Being pro-life is opposing the deliberate ending of a human life. I'm against abortion because it ends the life of an unborn baby. Similarly, I'm against euthanasia because it ends a human life. no matter the circumstances. Now, I understand there are differences. In abortion, the unborn baby has no say. In euthanasia, the individual is choosing to end their own life. While the circumstances differ, the principle remains the same. As a pro-life advocate, I am for life. Today, I want to start by sharing why I am against euthanasia. Let's start by understanding the debate, and this is where we find a place where we can agree. First, I want to acknowledge the complexity of this issue. I know what it's like to lose someone from a long and painful illness. I've sat with people in their final days, and I've experienced the slow and agonizing process of dying. I don't approach this topic lightly or naively. I understand why some people might choose euthanasia or why some people might support it. They see it as a way to alleviate suffering, but here's why I'm against it. Euthanasia is suicide, and I'm against suicide. Here's why suicide is not the answer, and this is where I would tell a story. Imagine this. You're driving along the road and you see a man standing by the bridge. Something doesn't feel right, so you stop your car and approach him. As you get closer, he climbs onto the railings and you realize he's planning to jump. What would you do? You're likely going to call out to him, urging him to step down. You'd say things like, "Please don't do this. Let's talk. There's hope and there's help. I can help you." Now imagine another person stops, but instead of helping, they start to encourage the man. They call him brave. They start applauding his decision. You're horrified. What kind of a person would do this? But what if more people stopped, forming a crowd that applauded his choice and cheered him on? Suddenly you find yourself the only person urging him to live. And now the crowd turns on you, calling you the monster for trying to save him. This is what euthanasia feels like. It's society endorsing suicide and reframing it as a dignified, brave, and wonderful choice, and turning on the people who are telling the one who is feeling suicidal that there is hope. I don't want to live in a society that celebrates suicide. I want to live in a society that values life. When someone is suffering, our response should be to help them, to love them, and to support them, not to encourage them to end their life. The pro-euthanasia movement is growing, and as a society, we need to prepare for these conversations. We have to know how to respond with compassion and conviction and affirm the value of life in every situation. There is a big lie about euthanasia, and I'm going to go through some of those lies. First is that it's for terminally ill patients. First, let's start where we agree. No one wants to see their loved one suffer. When people think of euthanasia, they often imagine someone who is mere days or even hours away from death, a person in immense pain, pleading with doctors for help. However, this perception is not an accurate reflection of what euthanasia truly entails. Today, I'm going to explore real cases, and I'm going to debunk some common euthanasia myths. The first myth is that euthanasia offers a peaceful death. One of the biggest misconceptions is that euthanasia provides a peaceful and a serene death. However, as described by Dr. Ronald W. Pies and Dr. Annette Hansen in MD Magazine, the reality is far from peaceful. According to their research, death by lethal injection can take up to 4 days. During this time, patients can wake up from unconsciousness, they can grasp for breath, there is vomiting, and it's not a dignified, so-called, end that many people envisioned. Dr. Joel B.Z., Associate Professor of Emory University and the School of Medicine and the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority, testified in front of the Senate. According to his testimony, Fraser Health is refusing to hand over the autopsy results of a woman who has been euthanized. However, according to Dr. Joel B.Z., other autopsies have been realized. What they're seeing from the expansion of euthanasia is concerning, especially when they examine how it's being carried out. An anesthesiologist recently raised concerns because they noted that the supplies of sodium thiopental had suddenly become scarce. And when they began investigating it, he discovered that the drug was manufactured in Italy, and because of that, they fall under the European Union, and the EU laws prohibit the production of a drug that's intended for executions. And this drug has been used for years in North America, not just in the euthanasia programs in Canada, but also for executions in the United States as part of the death penalty. And when the EU realized this, they imposed strict drug productions. Anesthesiologists also use this drugs as one of their first drugs administered to put patients under before surgery. However, obviously they use a different amount for a surgery than they do for the patients who are being killed through executions in the States or through euthanization in Canada. Through a Freedom of Information Act request, journalists and the NPR were given detailed autopsy reports of over 300 individuals who were executed in America. And according to these reports, 85% of the bodies showed twice the normal level of water in the lungs, which is a clear indication of drowning. This means that when this drug is administered, it causes a chemical drowning, and the feeling is similar to the experience of being waterboarded. Victims die from the sensation of being drowned, which is classified as a cruel and unusual punishment. And in Canada, this is one of the reasons we don't have the death penalty, because it's considered cruel and unusual. Yet, euthanasia uses the same process, but they frame it as compassionate and dignified. The process appears painful because a paralytic drug is administered, and this renders the person completely unable to move or cry out. If it wasn't for this paralytic, they might scream in agony or pain. In the cases where euthanasia is admitted via IV, the process takes 10 to 15 minutes. 10 to 15 minutes in which the individual is drowning to death. Now remember, chemical drowning is considered cruel and unusual punishment. It's actually banned in places like Guantanamo Bay. But it's rebranded as an act of empathy and compassion under the guise of dying with dignity. But it's not compassion. Look at how it's sold to us. When a movie or a TV show has a plot line that involves the death penalty, we're made to feel sorry for the criminal, and we see it as scary and horrific what's happening to them. It's a barbaric practice. But when a movie or TV show depicts euthanasia, it's seen as compassionate, loving, and peaceful, even though it is the same process. Myth number 2, euthanasia is only for the terminally ill. Another myth is that euthanasia is exclusively for terminally ill patients. However, there's alarming cases that challenge this belief. In Europe, over 200 psychiatric patients, people who could have lived meaningful lives with proper care, have been euthanized. And closer to home, just here in Ontario, actually in Toronto, we have the case of George and Shirley. They're in their 90s, they were married for over 70 years, and they decided they wanted to die together. They hosted a party to celebrate their lives, they went out to eat as a family, and then they laid in their beds together, held hands, while the doctor injected them with poison. This was not terminally ill. They were simply elderly. Since when does being old qualify as a terminal condition? In a minute, I'm going to talk about a lot more cases that show this to be a myth. But just know, euthanasia is simply not only for the terminally ill. In 2022, 36.8 were listed as cases of people who were euthanized for having disabilities. 86.3 were listed as a loss of ability to perform activities in daily life. Third myth is that euthanasia is only for adults. Some argue that euthanasia is restricted only to adults who can make informed decisions. Yet between 2016 and 2017, Belgium had 3 recorded cases of children ages 17, 11, and 9 who were euthanized. What were their conditions? Muscular dystrophy, a brain tumor, and cystic fibrosis. These young lives could have benefited from advancement in medicine and care, but instead their lives were cut short. Since then, Belgium, Netherlands, and Colombia all now allow children to be euthanized, and there are groups in Canada working to allow children to be euthanized here in Canada. Here's a quote from the National Post in January 24th, 2024. Canada is only weeks away from legalizing assisted suicide for Canadians whose only underlying condition is mental illness. There are reports that assisted death is being offered to Canadians who are suicidal, and MAiD advocates are already speaking openly about extending physical assisted death to children as young as 12. Now, it said in this article that they were only weeks away from legalizing it. However, the vote was delayed, and it won't be voted on until a couple of years from now. The fourth myth is that euthanasia is always voluntary. Perhaps the most troubling lie is that euthanasia is strictly voluntary. In Amsterdam, there was a woman who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she told the doctor when she was diagnosed, "When I come near the end of my diagnosis, I wish to be euthanized." However, as life progressed, she consistently told her caregivers she was not ready. Despite her objections, a doctor drugged her coffee to keep her calm and then restrained her and had her forcibly held down and injected. This was not her choice. There are quite a few disturbing cases, and I'm going to share those with you. And these are stories that you can tell. Remember, we start with where we agree, and then we share stories. And this is some of the stories that you can tell. These are all true stories. In Canada, Sheila brought her 24-year-old daughter, Candace, who had cerebral palsy, to the hospital because she had a seizure. Instead of receiving treatment, Sheila was pressured by doctors to euthanize her daughter. And when she refused, they told her she was selfish for refusing, and they insisted that death was the most compassionate option she could give her daughter. Thankfully, Sheila refused, and Candace continues to live happily 6 years later. And then there's Roger. He's a 42-year-old man who lives in Ontario. He had an incurable brain disease. Roger claims he's pressured to choose euthanasia instead of receiving the proper care. He secretly recorded the doctors who were discussing charging him $1,400 per day if he refused to be euthanized or leave the hospital. He was expressing feelings of despair, and one of the healthcare professionals immediately suggested euthanasia, and you can hear in the recordings them saying, "Hey, we can help you with that." Is that compassionate care, or is that cost-cutting? Then there's the case of Alan Nichols. Alan Nichols is a 61-year-old Canadian. He had a history of depression and other medical issues. He had lost his hearing when he was 12 years old, but now he was 61 and he lived all that life with his hearing loss. Now, during the time when he was feeling depressed, his family had him hospitalized so that they could help him. And while in the hospital, Alan Nichols pleaded with his brother to come and bust him out as soon as possible because he thought that they were going to kill him. But his family kept him in the hospital because they thought that they were going to help him. Shockingly, within just a month, Nichols had submitted a request for euthanasia and was killed, despite objections from his family, and also a nurse practitioner who was also opposed to this. The only medical condition listed on his euthanasia application for his death was hearing loss, something that had happened when he was 12 years old. His family was devastated, and they reported the case to the police and health authorities, arguing he did not meet legal requirements for euthanasia. According to the family, Nichols had not been taking some of his prescribed medication, and he wasn't using his cochlear implant that enabled him to hear. And because of that, he was not able to properly assist hospital staff in completing his euthanasia request. According to his brother, Gary Nichols, Alan was put to death. Then there's the case of 90-year-old Nancy Russell. She didn't want to live alone during COVID lockdowns, and she had a fear that she would die alone. When the lockdowns ended, she was happy to see her family again, and then news came that the lockdowns were coming back. Her doctor told her if she was euthanized before the lockdown started, then her family could be with her when she died, but if she didn't get euthanized, she would most likely die alone during the second wave of lockdowns. So she was killed, not because she was sick or dying, because she was afraid she might get sick and die during a COVID lockdown. Then there's Sean Taggart, a 41-year-old who was euthanized for having Lou Gehrig's disease. He was raising money for medical equipment he needed in order to be able to live in his home. He raised $12,400, but it just wasn't enough, and he didn't want to burden his family with the cost. So he was euthanized. While some might say he was euthanized because of Lou Gehrig's disease, Sean wanted to live, and had he raised the full amount of the medical equipment, he would have lived. The truth was, he was euthanized because he couldn't afford to live. Then there's Christine Gunther. She was a paraplegic former member of the Canadian military. Now, she testified in Parliament, and people were shocked to hear what she had to say. The Department of Veterans Affairs had offered her MAiD in writing, and even offered to provide the equipment. She received a letter stating that if she was so desperate, the department could arrange for MAiD. Now, Christine, who had injured her back during a training accident in 1989, said she'd been struggling for years and was asking for the government to pay for a wheelchair ramp to be installed in her home. Instead of paying for a wheelchair ramp, she was offered MAiD. Now, she represented Canada in the 2016 Paralympics. She's clearly embracing life despite her injury. She requested money for a wheelchair ramp. She was offered death. There's the case of the 27-year-old autistic woman from this year who has been offered euthanasia, and her father is in court right now trying to stop that from happening. There's the case of Jack Sorensen, whose wife tried to stop the euthanasia from happening. Her wife explained that her husband was not dying. Catherine, who is the wife, went to court saying that Jack wanted death, but his wanting of death was mental and not physical, that he needed help to deal with the stress of living with COPD, but the court sided with her husband and he was killed. There's the case of Rosina Comas, a 41-year-old woman who is facing eviction. She was killed September 26, 2021. Although chronic pain was listed as her reason, it was also listed her fear of the fact that she was facing eviction and would live on the streets. There was the case of Mary, a 55-year-old who had credit cards maxed out, chronic pain, and didn't like her apartment. Once again, chronic pain was listed as the reason, but also on the reason was her credit cards being maxed out and the fact that she didn't like her apartment. Those are some disturbing cases. Here are some disturbing doctors. Two of the most disturbing doctors are Ellen Wiebe and Stephanie Green. They've euthanized over 700 people, and their second job is to perform abortions. They've both done thousands of abortions. Some of the disturbing cases I've listed above, such as Rosanna Comas, the 41-year-old woman who was killed because she was facing eviction, and Mary, the 55-year-old with maxed out credit cards and a small apartment, were among their victims. So those are the stories. And so we tell a story, and any one of these disturbing stories can be told. And then you ask a question. We don't have the death penalty in Canada because we believe it's cruel, even for a serial killer. Do you have any concerns about the government killing a 41-year-old woman because she was getting evicted, or offering to kill a woman because she asked for a wheelchair ramp? Or if we start killing off autistic people, we're trying to guilt parents of adult children in their care to give permission for us to kill them? Do any of these stories cause you concern? The question I ask is this. There is medication that can be given to take away pain in the final stages of death. Can we care for our loved ones and make the death process peaceful without killing them? The next thing I want to talk about is the freedom of choice. When talking about euthanasia, one of the most common arguments is, shouldn't people be allowed to make choices about their own bodies and lives? And what about freedom and body autonomy? Let's start with the place of agreement. I understand this perspective well, and I strongly advocate for a limited government, and I believe in personal freedom is essential for a free society. My libertarian-leaning beliefs make my stance on euthanasia and abortion seem, contradictory. Let me be clear. I don't believe any rational human person truly supports the idea of euthanasia as an unrestricted right to make choices about one's body. You might think you do, but let's test that belief. And here's where you would tell a story. Imagine you're at a hospital. A beautiful 25-year-old woman walks in for an appointment with her doctor. As you're sitting in the waiting room together and you're chatting about why you're there, she explains to you that her fiancé has left her, and her heartbreak is unbearable. She feels like life will never be the same, and she cannot face the thought of talking to her friends or family about it. She wants to die, and she's come to ask her doctor to euthanize her. Would you say that this woman should be injected with poison and killed? I would hope most of you would say no. We recognize her life is valuable, even if she can't see it now. We'd want her to receive support, counseling, and a time to heal and grieve, not death. Now, imagine a 25-year-old woman comes into the hospital and she's in a wheelchair. Her head droops slightly to the side. She has multiple sclerosis, and she tells her doctor, I don't feel like I'm ever going to get married or find someone to love me. My life just isn't worth living. I want to die. Please help me. Now, if you believe the second woman has the right to be euthanized, but not the first, you don't truly support freedom of choice. What you're saying is that some lives are more valuable than others. And that is a very dangerous belief. When someone, like the first woman in our story, expresses suicidal thoughts, society responds by saying, your life is precious, even if you can't see us now. We're going to protect you and help you until you realize your own worth. But when someone with a disability expresses the same thoughts, we say, you're right, your life isn't worth saving. And here's the question to ask. Are lives with disabilities less valuable than those without? As a society, we cannot afford to create a system where people with challenges or disabilities are told their lives are not worth living. Both women in the story I told need support, encouragement, and love, not death. And here's a personal testimony that I read by someone named Mark Davis. He's a writer and speaker for Human Life Matters, and he offers a perspective on this issue. You see, Mark has multiple sclerosis, and he's faced moments of depression. He wrote a letter to his doctor and addressed his concern about legalized assisted suicide, and I'm going to read that letter for you. Should I ever request suicide, I want you to refuse to help me. Presume I'm speaking of depression or that MS has begun to affect my mental state. I would not make such a request in my right mind. If, in your judgment, I'm suffering from depression, give me the counseling I need. Protect me from myself. Protect me from others who would take my life before my natural death. I respect your role as my healer. Please don't become my killer. Mark's letter reveals a profound fear that in moments of vulnerability, he might ask for death and be granted it rather than receiving the care he truly needs. His words highlight the slippery slope of a society that devalues life. We have a responsibility to protect. So do I believe people should have the right to end their own lives? No, I don't. If someone wants to die, it's our responsibility as a society to step in, not to enable their death, but to remind them of their worth and help them rediscover the value of their life. A culture that embraces euthanasia abandons its most vulnerable members. It tells those struggling with illnesses, disabilities, or despair that their life doesn't have value. But we have to resist this culture of death. Instead, we should offer hope, healing, and unwavering support. We have to affirm that every life has inherent value, no matter the circumstances. The next argument I face is dying with dignity. I will often hear the question, isn't it better for someone to die with dignity? We don't allow animals to suffer when they're sick, so why should we let people we love suffer? To answer this question, I'm going to break down the 3 key sections. First, the difference between animals and people. Second, the distinction between giving comfort and suicide. And 3, the dangers of using the term dying with dignity. First, let's look at the difference between animals and people. This picture you're looking at here, these are my dogs. They're adorable, loving, and joy to be around. I have 4 children, and I often joke that these dogs are my favorite. But to be honest, and what everyone knows, is my love for my kids far surpasses what I feel for my dog. As much as we love our pets, our society still values human life more highly than animal life. For example, when I leave home, I might lock my dogs in a room for their safety and for the safety of my couch, but I'd never do that to my children. I had a friend recently that put her dog down because her dog could no longer climb stairs. And carrying the dog in and out of the house was too difficult. So they put the dog down. When my mom faced the same issue, we moved to a house with no stairs and we supported her through her surgery. Similarly, we might see a racehorse get put down if it breaks a leg and can no longer compete. But an athlete who suffers a career-ending injury, we don't kill them. We help them recover and adapt to a new life. So first, we find a place to agree. I love my pets and I don't want to see them suffer. And I love my children and I don't want to see them suffer. I love my children far more than my pets. And then you tell a story. I once had a friend who had a cat. The family loved this cat. But as the cat got older and lost the control of their bladder, this cat started peeing all over the house. They constantly had to clean up cat pee off their furniture and their carpet, and came to a point where they had to put their loved cat down. And I asked a question. My grandma also started to lose control of her bladder. Should I put my grandmother down? Or should I instead just buy her some Depends? The point is, we inherently recognize that human life has greater value than animal life, and that's why we invest time, energy, and money into developing medicine, pain management, and end-of-life care for humans, something we don't do for animals. Treating people like animals, no matter how much we love animals, would make for a cruel and dehumanized society. Second, let's talk about the difference between giving comfort and suicide. Let's start with the place of agreement. I approach this question with empathy and personal experience. I have seen loved ones suffer through long and painful illnesses. My grandfather battled diabetes and Parkinson's. My grandmother died of Alzheimer's. And I lost somebody else who had a 15-year fight with illness. And my mother passed away from cancer. These experiences have taught me the importance of comfort care. And I strongly believe Canada should actually invest more in hospice care. There should be hospice care in every single town. Hospice provides a compassionate environment where families can spend quality time with their loved ones, be supported by doctors and nurses who are trained to manage pain and provide comfort. Here's my question. Why do you think we have to choose between letting someone suffer and ending their life? Why can't providing comfort be an option? When we prioritize comfort and care, we affirm the value of life even in final stages. We don't need to choose between letting someone suffer and ending their lives. Instead, we can ensure that they are cared for with dignity and love. And third, the term and the danger of the term dying with dignity. Let's talk about this phrase. The term is problematic because it suggests suffering or having a disability diminishes a person's dignity. It implies that those who choose to live through their suffering lack dignity, while those that choose to end their life possess dignity. This sends a harmful message. Dignity is tied to ability, and when that ability fades, so does your worth. And here I would share a story. Joey Feek was a wife and a mother who was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and she knew her time was limited. But instead of giving up, she focused on loving her husband and preparing her child for life without her. And during this time, she did a lot of social media, and she inspired others even right up to her final days. Joey lived with dignity, not because she avoided suffering, but because she embraced life fully all the way until the end. Another example is my grandfather. As he lay dying, he remained true to his values, whispering to nurses about Jesus, even when he could barely speak. He didn't let illness strip him of his purpose or identity, and that is dying with dignity. Another example is my mother who passed away from cancer, and the same thing. When doctors would come to speak to her, she was always witnessing and talking about the love of God. Liz, a mother of 4 who was battling cancer, wrote this. I'm going to read what she wrote. The moment we label suicide an act of dignity, we're implying that people like me who are undignified for not ending our lives, or worse, that we're a costly burden on society. What a lonely, uncharitable world we live in, if suffering is seen as undignified and unworthy of care. Here's the question. Do you believe a person who lives their life and fights to live right up until the end is undignified? If dying with dignity means being euthanized, wouldn't it mean that dying without being euthanized is undignified? Do you think that there could be a problem with telling our fellow citizens with disabilities that living their life with this disability is undignified? All right, so after all of this, what can we do? Sometimes we hear about things that are going on in the world, and then we're just left to head home. It can be overwhelming because we can say, okay, this is horrible. I don't like that my country is doing this, but what can I even do about it? Well, here's what you can do. First, start by educating yourself about the topic. You need to know these stories and these cases. We can't hide and pretend that these don't happen. Then, you need to share the stories and you have to speak. You can't use the excuse this is not a polite topic, which I know in Canada, that is a problem. And then, most importantly, when someone we love faces the end of their life, we have a responsibility to show them that their life matters. We have to tell them and demonstrate to them that they're not a burden. We can provide comfort, support, and care. Euthanasia is not just a personal choice. It's increasingly tied to economic factors. According to a study published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, euthanasia could save the healthcare system around $136.8 million annually. This raises a terrifying question. Are we valuing cost savings over human lives? The narrative we're told that euthanasia is a compassionate option for those in their final hours. It's far from the full story. The truth is that euthanasia is being offered to, and in some cases forced on, individuals who are not terminally ill and have not asked to die. It's a solution-driven, cost-saving measurement. It's not compassion. If the stories that I've shared do not disturb you, then you've bought into the culture of death. But if you feel a sense of unease, that's good. It means you're questioning the narrative. Let's rethink what we believe about euthanasia and recognize that we might be perpetrating a dangerous lie.